Jamie Gass. Jamie is Pioneer Institute's director of the Center for School Reform. At Pioneer, he has framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. Previously, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Education, Quality, and Accountability as Senior Policy Analyst Technical Writer and in the State Budget Office under 2 Massachusetts governors. In the 1990s, Jamie worked for the Dean of Boston University School of Education, Boston University Management Team, in its historic partnership with the Chelsea Public Schools. He has appeared on various local and national media outlets. He has been quoted in The Economist, Educational Week, and the Boston Globe, and his op-eds are regularly published in the Boston Herald, the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, the Wall Street Journal, Education Next, and the City Journal. Jamie speaks on academic standards, school choice options, and school accountability at events throughout the country. He earned a Bachelor's of Arts in International Relations from BU. It is with great pleasure I introduce Jamie Gass.
Donna, thanks so much. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. It's certainly true that some of the folks who disagree with us at Pioneer Institute wish that our op-eds were punished. But no, we've been very fortunate that a lot of the media outlets in Massachusetts have liked our pieces and been gracious enough to run them. So I want to thank you for coming out tonight on what is a cold evening. It's a very important topic, and it's got a lot of details. I'd like to try to move through it quickly and not belabor it too much, but give you a sense of what Common Core is about and why we've got so much concern about it. So just to begin, what Common Core is a set of English and math standards that were developed by the National Governors Association, which is the trade organization that represents not states, but the governors from each state, as well as the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is the commissioner of education in each state. It was funded, the development of it was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've spent about $150, $170 million, not only paying for the development of the standards themselves, but also funding a lot of the various education trade groups in order to advocate and push them throughout the country. At this point, there's about 45 states that have adopted. Most of the states adopted through a federal grant program called the Race to the Top, which was initiated in 2009 by the Obama administration, in which states had to compete for approximately $4.3 billion of their own money. But they needed to sign on to a variety of different policy objectives that were okayed from the U.S. Department of Education. And among those were Common Core standards and then national testing that in Massachusetts and will ultimately replace MCAS over the next year or so. But before I get into it, I'd like to kind of give you some historical context to give you a sense of how we got here, not only nationally, but here in Massachusetts. So I think the Founding Fathers were very wise. They understood that the national government has proper roles and responsibilities and jurisdictions, primarily in foreign policy and defense and trade and commerce, but that most of the issues that most directly touch the lives of citizens, particularly domestic issues, are really properly controlled by the state and local governments. It's no accident that the U.S. Constitution essentially is silent on K-12 education. The founders were wise, they understood, and were very detailed about what they put in the state constitutions, whether it's the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which was written by John Adams, it's the oldest written constitution in the world, or whether it's the Virginia Constitution, which was drafted by James Madison and George Mason. These state constitutions are very, very specific, and in some instances have paragraph after paragraph explaining how it's the interests of state legislators and citizens to perpetuate and to cherish the interests of public education. The founders, I think, were quite wise. They understood that you wanted to have all of the decision-making related to public schooling, which is the wellspring, really, of our republic. You want those determined by the people that are doing the work in the classrooms and the parents whose children are in those classrooms. And so, again, while the federal government has limits, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, the state governments really have been the main drivers behind public education for well over 2 centuries. This is something that, even in the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville, a French aristocrat who came to the United States to look at this country and wrote this 2-volume Democracy in America, he said it's unique in this country. It's unlike what you would find throughout Europe, where kings and queens and czars and ministers all from on high determine these decisions about how people's lives are governed. That this democracy, this United States of America, is unique because the ideas come from the people, and they control it through things like New England town hall meetings and the like. And this system, and they call it federalism, which is proper balance between the national government and the state government, I would argue that this system that we have and our system of laws has actually served us quite well. We essentially have gone from a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard and within 2 centuries to be the most powerful country in the world. But I think it's also without question that gradually after World War II, notably in the late 1950s with Sputnik, which was sort of the space race, that public education was beginning to decline, and it was obvious. It was so obvious by 1983 that President Ronald Reagan initiated a commission which was called, authored a report called A Nation at Risk, and it described all the conditions of the decline of K-12 education, how we essentially had gone from among the top performing countries in the world to about 15 or 20th. In particular, it was clear that if this system of education had been imposed on us by a foreign enemy, this Nation at Risk report said it would be an act of war. And that was true even in Massachusetts. We had been one of the leaders in public education from the beginning. John Adams and Horace Mann in the 1830s, who was sort of the father of public education. Everyone had looked to the Commonwealth as a leader. But really, by the 1980s, we were about middle of the pack on the SAT, both in the reading and math. So we too, like the rest of the country, were suffering from various degrees of stagnation and decline in terms of the performance of our students. But what this Nation at Risk report did not do was come up with lots of top-down prescriptions from Washington, D.C. on how to solve these problems. Because people on the left, people on the right, Democrats, Republicans, everybody have always understood that K-12 education is the proper purview of state and local governments, and if we were going to figure out solutions, that they were going to have to come locally. Of course, there had been advocates for the last several decades of a sort of uniform, top-down set of national standards, testing, and curriculum. These folks tended to prefer a more workforce development or soft skills approach to K-12 education. They didn't think it was really the function of K-12 education to create citizens for our republic, but that it was really more of a workforce development model. I would argue that that thinking, that mindset, is really what has contributed to the decline of public education in this country. It's no question that people expect to be well-trained for jobs, but you need to have strong skills in the liberal arts and reading and writing and arithmetic in order to succeed, in order to be an active citizen. And then there's also been folks, too, that over the last several decades that have been big advocates of school choice, charter schools and vocational technical schools, private schools, parochial schools, that the way to improve public education is to inject more choice and competition among the public and the private system, give parents more choices so that they can select what's best suited for their children. But what Massachusetts did in 1993 was not only unique, but has turned out to be historic. The results are really quite remarkable. Tom Birmingham was a pretty liberal Democrat and later became the Senate President in Massachusetts. Mark Roosevelt, another liberal Democrat who is the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, coupled together with Bill Weld, a moderate to liberal Republican governor, and they crafted its landmark 1993 Education Reform Act. And really what it was a grand bargain that made not only good politics, but good policy. And that bargain was putting a great deal of additional resources into K-12 education at the state level, as well as a minimum commitment from all communities on funding. And Massachusetts has spent, in the last 20 years, has spent over $100 billion on K-12 education, and at the state and local level is spending approximately $9 billion annually. In exchange for the money were all the hard things that people in K-12 education had not really wanted to do over the previous decades. Specifically, they redirected the whole conversation about academic standards away from fuzzy math and soft skills and self-esteem, all the things that had really kind of led to the big declines. They redirected the conversation, really with the able work of this lady here, Sandy Stotsky, to return it to a commitment to the liberal arts. And what does that mean? It means kids reading high-quality classic literature, poetry, and drama in their English classes. It turns out that the vocabulary and the knowledge found in texts like Sherlock Holmes and Charles Dickens and Edith Wharton and Huckleberry Finn, that these matter a lot. They matter not just because the vocabulary is better, but they matter because they teach kids about lessons of friendship, of comedy, of tragedy, of the kinds of things that bind us together as human beings and frankly make for good citizenship. That's on the English side in these standards. On the math side, what they did is that they observed all of the hard-won lessons from most of the high-performing Asian countries that the Nation at Risk report in 1983 said that you have to compete with those countries to compete in the 21st century. Specifically, they made sure that the kids in Massachusetts had standards that got them prepared for Algebra 1 for the 8th grade. Algebra 1 is the gateway for all higher level mathematics. You're never going to be a scientist or an engineer or a mathematician or a statistician if you don't have a command of Algebra 1, because that is what gets you to the pre-calculus, calculus, trigonometry, which leads to what they call STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And these standards are then coupled with the MCAS test, which you all know about, and they instituted that so that you could measure student achievement and that the graduation diploma actually meant something. They also added teacher testing and aligned the expectations of the students in the standards, the testing for the students, and the teacher testing all together. That was sort of the golden triangle of the academic success here. And again, the architect of that was Dr. Stotsky. Also injected some competition through some very, very high quality charter schools, which are essentially public schools that are authorized by the Board of Ed and shut down if they don't meet performance measures after 5 years. It's a different conversation, but the fact remains is that the charter schools in Massachusetts are some of the highest performing public schools in the country. Across the country, the charter school record is a mixed one. In Massachusetts, it's not the case. There's a lot of the urban charter schools bridge the achievement gaps between poor and minority students, and frankly have those students outperforming kids in some of the wealthiest suburbs in the state. So it's the grand bargain. It was the money in exchange for the standards and accountability measures. And the results have been stunning. And I'll walk you through those quickly. In 2005, Massachusetts was the first state in the nation to score #1 on every category and every grade tested on the NAEP test. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's the nation's report card. It's a sample test that every state in the union takes. No state had ever been #1 on every grade tested, every category tested, and in 2005, Massachusetts did it. and then it did it again in 2007, 2009, 2011, and just a couple months ago it was released again in 2013. I say that it's really the equivalent of winning 5 World Series back-to-back and doing it in 4 consecutive games each time. But as the Nation at Risk report made clear in 1983, it's not just competing with, frankly, a lot of low-performing to moderate-performing states. The real goal of K-12 education is to be able to compete with the highest-performing countries in the world. So in 2007, Massachusetts tested as its own individual country. It was only one of 2 states to do this. Minnesota was the other one, on a test called the TIMSS test. It's the best respected international math and science test. And Massachusetts 8th graders tied for #1 in the world in science. And then in the area of mathematics, we were among the top 5 highest performing countries in the world. So we were right up there with Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan and South Korea. Again, all the countries that for 20 years or more, people have said, you've got to compete with these countries to compete in the 21st century. So in a way, this is the good news. The good news is that there's these historic accomplishments, that the race to the top that the Obama administration initiated in 1993 was really the race to become Massachusetts. The bad news is that a lot of the groups that I mentioned at the beginning, the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, Achieve, Inc., the Gates Foundation, the American Federation for Teachers Shanker Institute, the more right-leaning Thomas B. Fordham Institute, people that had long time been advocates of national standards testing and curriculum, but frankly hadn't improved student achievement anywhere in the last 20 years, they decided that this was the right time to push for national standards. And that's exactly what they did through Common Core and the accompanying national testing that will go along with it. So they moved this conversation along. They got states to sign on through the governor's office and through the commissioners of education. Even though 45 states have adopted, the fact is that 95% of the states that adopted, their state legislatures had no bills, they had no hearings, there were really no public input from the state legislature. And as we know from the way in which this country was set up with both the Continental Congress and from the Constitutional Convention, is that for states to be represented in national policy making, delegates from the state legislature need to be sent to a national body. That's what we do in this country. That's how we make national policy. The entity that would be doing that would be the US Congress, but of course they weren't consulted either because the way in which the Race to the Top grant was paid for was through the stimulus package. So there were never any hearings in the US Congress about national standards testing or curriculum. There was in fact no hearings about having a federal Race to the Top grant that states would have to compete for in order to participate and get their money back. So Pioneer Institute, as Donna mentioned, is an independent think tank. We are completely nonpartisan for these purposes. It's important to reiterate that. We do not endorse any candidates. We do not align with any political party. We do not take any government money. We are known, I think, for trying to commission and author and promulgate high-quality, peer-reviewed, independent research. We are known, I think, for trying to call things like we see them and let the chips fall where they may. But given that Massachusetts was really the trophy that the Common Core advocates had to have, they had to be able to say Massachusetts adopted in order to get all these other states to fall in line, we initially started our research on Common Core around where any conversation about academic standards needs to start, which is what is the academic quality of these standards? And so we enlisted Dr. Stotsky, who had worked on the standards in Massachusetts. She had worked on the standards in Indiana. She'd worked on the standards in Texas and was a widely respected author. She had been appointed by the President of the United States to the National Mathematics Panel. She was among only 19 people in the country to serve on that prestigious commission. And we coupled her together with a guy named Jim Milgram. He's a professor of mathematics at Stanford University who had worked on the very high quality math standards in California and Utah and a handful of other places. And then we had a third researcher work on these evaluations. His name is Zev Werman. He's a Silicon Valley engineer who had also worked on the California math standards. And what they did in these crosswalks, where they're evaluating standard by standard back and forth between the Massachusetts standards, the Minnesota standards, the Texas and Indiana standards, all the high-performing, high-standard states, is that they were looking at the quality in both English and math. And what they determined is that at every step of the way, and these are 40, 50-page, very detailed reports of every draft that Common Core produced, is that Common Core was of significantly lower quality in both English and math than what high standard states like Massachusetts already had. Specifically, Common Core cut the amount of classic literature, poetry, and drama, which had been the secret ingredient in the success in Massachusetts. They cut that in Common Core by about 60%. So there's no Huckleberry Finn, there's no Dickens novels. There are some things in there that I think all of us would agree are good. Things like reading the Gettysburg Address, reading A Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King. The problem is that the architect of Common Core, and Dr. Stotsky will talk a little bit more about David Coleman, he says that the way to study these texts is by ignoring all of the historical context. So you're supposed to entirely forget that the Gettysburg Address is consecrating a cemetery, that it takes place at around, in the middle of the Civil War, etc. You're supposed to forget all that. From my point of view, those are great texts for kids to read, but the fact is that they really belong in a history class. Most English teachers are not really trained and didn't go into teaching English to teach historical documents and historical speeches. They want to read and teach classic literature, poetry, and drama. On the math side, the Common Core advocates also ignored all the evidence from Massachusetts, from California, and all of the high-performing East Asian countries. Specifically, they pushed forward the access to Algebra 1, not to 8th grade, not to 9th grade, but to really early 10th grade. They also used an experimental form of geometry that has never been successful in any place that it's been tried before, including the former Soviet Union. And Common Core math really stops at what Professor Milgram has described as Algebra 2 light. There's no pathway for the STEM because there really is no pre-calculus, calculus, or trigonometry. So in terms of science and technology and engineering and mathematics, it is really a path. Common Core is really a path to nowhere. The next piece of research that we decided to look at, because as I mentioned at the beginning, everybody across the political spectrum in the policy world has always known that there are limits on the federal role and federal footprint in K-12 education. And so we enlisted a guy named Kent Talbert and another guy named Bob Eitel. They were the general counsel and deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration, so the two highest ranking lawyers in the federal government in the previous administration. And what these two lawyers mapped out in dispassionate, lawyerly detail is that there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from funding, directing, validating national standards testing and curriculum. And those 3 laws are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson. I think all of us can agree that he was not exactly a Tea Party president. Then there was the General Education Provisions Act, which was signed by Richard Nixon in 1970, which is basically a funding bill for the small amount. It's only about 10% of the funding for K-12 education comes from the feds. And this GEPA, they call it, that's one of the funding mechanisms. And then the third law is the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself in 1979, and that was signed by Jimmy Carter. I think it's worth noting because many of the folks that are proponents of Common Core or critical of our opinion say that the opponents of Common Core are fringe or extreme or Tea Party people or what have you, but 2 of the 3 laws that were signed by presidents, U.S. presidents, were signed by Democratic presidents. These are not, what I would argue, these are not exactly extreme positions. They are settled law. And everybody across the spectrum has realized that. Specifically, one of the things that they cite, and Donna mentioned it too, is that in order for states to get a waiver from the No Child Left Behind law, U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan created additional conditions to these waivers from the No Child Left Behind law. U.S. Secretary of Education are allowed to provide waivers, but they're not allowed to add additional conditions onto waivers that haven't been approved by Congress. And the conditions that Secretary Duncan added were to adopt Common Core and national testing, and those were not approved by the U.S. Congress, so they are illegal. Specifically, what the lawyers pointed out is that when the U.S. Department of Education directly funded the two national testing consortia, so Massachusetts is part of the PARC testing consortia, these two testing consortia got $350 million directly from the U.S. Department of Education. That, again, is a direct violation of federal law. So, the next, and in the back of the room, and he's now done 2 columns on it. The syndicated columnist, George Will, who reaches about 30 million readers across the country, has done 2 columns in the last couple of years, specifically citing our research. So it's not just the opinion of these attorneys, and I think they're very, very careful and very meticulous about the research they did on it, but it's also the opinion of, again, one of the best respected syndicated columnists in the country. So the final piece of research we took a look at, given that this is going to impact 45 million school children, given the fact that 90% of the funding for this will be coming from the state and local governments, we thought someone ought to take a look at the cost. Again, most state legislatures did not do a cost projection. Most governors, the Massachusetts Department of Education included, did not do a cost projection. We thought that somebody around this conversation actually ought to say, take a look at what this is going to cost. So we enlisted a guy named Ted Rebarber. He had been a staffer at the U.S. Department of Education under the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, and the first administration of President Bill Clinton. So he had worked for both Republicans and Democrats at the federal level. He was the kind of guy that was a Capitol Hill staffer. He was in the room when former President Clinton, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole were all hashing out the small amount of federal money and federal programs. He also had a lot of experience with testing and testing costs at the state level. So Ted and his team ran the projections of what it's going to cost. They looked at the multi-year technology costs, which are the biggest cost driver for Common Core. They looked at the textbook alignment and the professional development necessary to train teachers in aligning with Common Core standards. And the figure that they came up for the national level, which I think actually will be proven to be a mid-range cost, actually, a cost projection, is $16 billion. For Massachusetts, it'll be $350 million. So even though we have spent $100 billion to become the highest performing state in the country and internationally competitive in math and science, we're going to have to spend another $350 million to adopt and align what Dr. Stotsky and other very well-respected experts in math and English have said are qualitatively lower quality standards than what we already had. There are a variety of other issues that circulate in and around Common Core. Part of the race to the top was that states had to sign on to what they call a longitudinal data collection system. We're in the process of doing more research on that topic. But let me just tell you that some of the things we've seen so far, including some of the things found in a report called Promoting Grit and Tenacity by the U.S. Department of Education, is creepy. I'm the father of 2 daughters, one of whom is in the Newton Public Schools in Boston area. And when you see the kinds of things that, not next week or a month from now, but ultimately what they want to, the kind of data and the kind of mechanisms that they want to use to gather data on our children, it's appalling. They've also had to brush aside what they call FERPA laws, which are the parental and student privacy laws. The U.S. Department of Education has essentially brushed those aside to push this data collection. But stay tuned on that front because we have more research coming out in the coming months on that. And then also one of the things, again, Pioneer is a big advocate of school choice, whether it's private schools or high quality, proven charter schools or vocational technical schools or virtual schools. We think that parents ought to be able to pick what's best suited for their kids. The problem is that if all these schools and all these states are being herded into the same set of standards and the same set of tests, school choice is not really going to mean an awful lot in that environment. We've got more ongoing research on that front. I guess I'd wrap up by saying the good news is that the more state legislators who are paying for this and the more citizens find out about it, and Dr. Stotsky and I have been going to about 20 states in the last couple years, the more people find out about this, the more irritated they get. Because they weren't told about it, it's going to have a huge impact at what's taught in their classrooms. I have to say, and we've spoken in front of 5 people and we've spoken in front of 900 people, I have to say that when you look over at the audience, oftentimes 70% of the audience are moms and grandmothers who I think all of us know do a lot of the homework with kids. They're seeing the poor quality. We are seeing this in Indianapolis with Catholic school moms. We're seeing it in Salt Lake City with public school moms. We're seeing it in Florida, seeing it in red states. We're seeing it in blue states. Just a couple weeks ago, the state of New York basically punted on Common Core. There was a huge firestorm from both upper state New York and from Long Island, very different kind of sets of parents there who are really outraged. You're seeing more and more teacher unions in blue states that are very, very concerned about this because what they really want to do is stack the national standards, a national curriculum, and the national test on top of teacher evaluations, which a lot of this will be dictated from Washington, D.C. And I think teachers are beginning to wake up to the fact that they're going to not be able to teach what it is that they desired when they went into teaching, but that it's going to be scripted and that this is going to be very, very problematic. That a teacher in Pittsfield, where Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, she could teach Moby Dick. But the fact is that it's not in the exemplar text of Common Core. It's not going to be on the tests. And if she's evaluated on what the kids are tested on, it's against her best interest to teach something like Moby Dick. So states are pulling out of the testing. We've just in the last several months, we've seen Indiana and Florida and Georgia and Oklahoma and Alabama and Utah pull out of the testing side of it. But the fact is that this is a very, very important issue. There's a lot of details, as you sort of have patiently heard over the last 20 minutes or so. I really appreciate your interest in the topic, appreciate you coming out on a cold night. But the real main event in some respects is Dr. Stotsky, because the fact is that while people in around K-12 education have been wringing their hands for 25 or 30 years about how to improve student achievement dramatically and make our kids well prepared for lives as citizens, but also have the mathematical skills necessary. She's done it. And there's nobody really in the country who can make that claim. There's nobody whose standards have correlated with these historic improvements. So with that, I look forward to any questions you have and look forward to hearing what Sandy has to say. Yeah.
Let me introduce you.
We'll take questions after Sandra speaks. And someone said to me when we were getting ready for the speakers to come, she said, "How did you get these 2 speakers?" Amazing. And that's what you're going to hear. These are amazing people here. We're very honored and very blessed to have Sandra and Jamie here today. Just a little intro on Sandra. Sandra Stotsky grew up in Bridgewater and graduated from its public schools. She did her undergraduate work at the University of Michigan and completed a doctorate in reading research at Harvard Graduate School of Education. She was an active citizen in Brookline for over 40 years, serving as a board member and then president of the League of Women Voters in the 1970s. She was an elected town meeting member for 10 years and elected library trustee for 14. She's also served on many school search and selectmen appointed committees. Her 5 children all graduated from Brookline Public Schools. She served as a Senior Associated Commissioner, that's a professional position at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed from 1999 to 2003, where she was in charge of developing or revising the state's K through 12 standards. She served on the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Ed from 2006 to 2010, and that was a citizen's position. On the National Mathematics Advisory Panel from 2006 to 2008, and on the Common Core Validation Committee from 2009 to 2010. She was one of the 5 members of the Validation Committee who would not sign off on the standards as being validated. She is also an editor of NCTE's premier research journal. That's the Research in the Teaching of English from 1991 to 1997. She has published extensively in professional journals and written several books. Sandra now travels the country speaking about the truth about Common Core. It is with great pleasure I introduce Sandra Spencer.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. Let me begin with a few remarks about what my philosophy was when I was in the Department of Ed, because your children or grandchildren or your neighbor's children have been learning under those standards for over 10 years, and now they are in the process of being changed, and you should know a little bit about the philosophy that generated those standards, because there is a very opposite philosophy now coming from Common Core, which is being implemented in the last few years and will be tested next year. First of all, what was very central to my philosophy was the importance of raising everybody's academic achievement. I was concerned with making sure, because our public schools have been declining for about 50 years, this is not new, how to get all kids doing better, not just groups of kids. I was interested in all kids. The goal was not particularly to close gaps, which is what you hear all the time today. It was to raise the floor for everybody, and those are two different directions. Second part of my philosophy was to focus as much as possible on content knowledge, because there is no way you can develop so-called critical thinking or even good analytical thinking unless you have a fund of knowledge in your head. It's not good enough to have it in the computer that you get through Google. That really doesn't help you when you're reading or trying to read analytically, never mind critically. And then third, and this is a piece that has been totally absent from what the federal government is now doing, or has been doing with Common Core, I was concerned with how to raise the caliber of the teaching corps. And that was directly related to the charge I was given, which was to revise teacher licensing regulations, administrator licensing regulations, and to revise all the licensure tests for teachers in the state. And that was indeed what I spent a lot of my time on, because if you want to have first-class standards taught, you have to have teachers who can teach to those first-class standards, and that means, among other things, raising the academic bar for who gets into an education school, teacher preparation program, especially in the elementary years, where you need all-purpose, almost Renaissance teachers who can teach just about every subject before you get into the middle schools and high schools. So that was what was underlying my own approach to what I did in Massachusetts, and the efforts bore fruit, but they all were coordinated together. It's important to have first-class standards, but by themselves, they are not enough. And I have opposed, since I began to become familiar with Common Core standards, their own efforts in these 3 areas, one of which was to try to lower the ceiling rather than to increase all students' academic achievement, and that maybe accounts for why they left out the STEM preparatory standards, which means that you have something between weak algebra 2 and calculus whether it's in grade 12 or in high school. And their focus on skills as opposed to content knowledge. They're not terribly interested, Common Core's developers and the English language arts certainly is not interested in content knowledge, it's interested in skills. And they've given our education schools basically a free pass. There's been almost no attempt to look at how to upgrade our education schools, restructure them, reform them, and deal with improving the teaching core we have in this country, which is very different from the teaching core in other countries. In other countries, teachers come from the top 10%, 20% of a high school graduating class, the top third of a college class. In our country, we know this from several independent sources, our prospective elementary teachers come from the bottom third of the college cohort. We have a very different view of who should even become a teacher, and then where you want to make sure that they are able to teach to high standards. Now let me get to Common Core standards. And my first initiation with Common Core's standards came when I was placed on its so-called validation committee. As its name suggests, this was a committee formed in 2009 that was supposed to guarantee or try to ensure that Common Core standards were internationally benchmarked, comparable to the best there was out there in other high-achieving countries, that it was research-based as well as internationally benchmarked, and that the standards were rigorous. I was among the few people on that committee who could not sign off because we did not think that any of those major conditions was met. Before I go into the gory details of the validation committee, let me talk a little bit about who developed Common Core standards, because that was a process I was familiar with at the state level. Who do you get to develop good standards in any subject? You pick up anybody off the street, or do you ask people who are experts, expert teachers and experts from the college level, both? And it turns out that Common Core's college readiness standards, which will be the basis for the grade 11 test that is going to be piloted this year, maybe next year. It could have started already. I don't know where different communities were chosen to pilot the PARCC test in pieces. But the people who were put on the Common Core Standards Development Work Group, which was the first group that got going in the spring of 2009, almost all of them were connected to the testing industry. That was the first clue to me that there was something amiss with these standards. There was exactly one mathematician on the committee, no high school math teachers, no high school English teachers, no literary scholars, but a lot of people connected to different testing groups. And they came up in the summer with their draft college readiness standards. At that time, the lead writers for the grade level standards were selected and they were announced. You may be familiar with their names. I think Jamie mentioned two of them for the ELA committee, David Coleman and Susan Pimentel. And when you look at their backgrounds, it turns out that neither of them ever taught from K to 12 or above. Neither of them ever published anything in the field of education. Neither of them had doctorates in English or reading, and basically nobody in the field had ever heard about them. They were virtually unknown to the whole field. The math people, the same situation, except for something very important. Two of them had PhDs in mathematics. They did know mathematics, which then makes it puzzling as to why they left out those STEM preparatory standards, because they knew they were missing. And to this day, we have not had any official explanation about why those standards aren't in the document. There were pre-calculus standards in the Massachusetts standards document. They weren't required for a high school diploma because we couldn't do that. And no state could do that if it expected to have a large number of its students graduate. You couldn't require in this country, as they may do in a few other places, I've been told, like maybe Singapore or Hong Kong, we could not require all students to complete trigonometry as a condition for a high school diploma. But we didn't even have the thought that we would not even include those standards in the math document that I supervised in 2001, because it was important to signal that high school math departments did not end with a weak Algebra 2 course. Superintendents needed to know that, and others needed to know that high school math needed to go beyond a weak Algebra 2 if we would ever get into the 21st century. Because unless you understand more math than that, you can't get into any of the STEM fields in college. This is difficult for people to understand, including me, if you're from the humanities. But mathematics is the language of science. It is the language of economics today. It is the language of computer science. It is the language of a growing number of majors. And we will have fewer doctors, fewer engineers. It is certainly the language of engineering colleges, where they expect students to begin with a calculus course. So here we have standards writers, two of whom are mathematicians, one of whom told us very honestly in 2010 at a March board meeting that he was invited by the commissioner to come and tell us about the standards. I was the only one on the board who said, please explain what you mean by college readiness. And he said, well, it doesn't prepare for STEM. Not one board member raised a question. Why not? To this day, why not? Jim Milgram, who was on the validation committee and knew the mathematicians, because mathematicians do speak to each other. They may find it difficult to speak to people who don't understand higher mathematics, but they do speak to each other. And he was trying to get Common Core's math standards to go past algebra, weak Algebra 2. He never could. He himself does not understand why the pathway to calculus is not there. In over 50% of Massachusetts towns and cities, our students get to a good Algebra 1 course in grade 8. That gives them access in high school to advanced math and science courses both. Because remember, you can't take an advanced physics course in high school without the math background. For those of you who are not in math and science, this may, as it did for me for many years, just sail over my head. But you have to understand that that is where the 21st century lies, in people with that kind of knowledge and ability to pursue higher math and science, at least in addition to anything else they may have to work on. Now, let's go beyond the qualifications of the standards writers, which were basically almost non-existent for the task they were assigned. We do not know to this day why they were chosen, who chose them, what they were paid, what their contract said. Why? Because, as Jamie indicated, these were all private groups that have created Common Core standards. And it was a private foundation, the Gates Foundation, that subsidized them. So even though I have suggested to reporters, call up, see if you can find out, there's nothing to FOIA. No private group has to give you information. And yet over 45 boards of education in this country, this is something I still do not understand, agreed to adopt standards that were copyrighted by these private organizations, for which they could get no information whatsoever, could not even bother to ask what was the college readiness standard, nor did these boards of education, because I've asked as I go around the country testifying, and I often speak to boards of education or at least meet their chairs, Did you ever ask your own teaching faculty in higher education, did they look at these college readiness standards and give you their opinion of them? Not one. Not one, even in Massachusetts, not one asked their own teaching faculty in higher education. After all, it is really just common sense. If you want to develop college readiness standards that are going to give credit, and that's the little connection that isn't made clear by the newspapers, unfortunately, but the whole idea of college readiness means that if a student is determined to have passed this grade 11 test, they will be eligible for credit-bearing courses in their freshman year. Now, what a level of those freshman level courses going to be depends on the level of the college readiness test. And we don't know yet because the cut score hasn't been set. But if it's a weak Algebra 2 in content, we know that the cut score is going to be about 2 grades lower than that. That is going to be college readiness in this country. And at first, and this is why Jim Milgram was pushing as hard as he could. Remember, he's a mathematician at Stanford, but he's not fighting for a private university like Stanford. The first draft that ever came out had Algebra 1 as the college readiness level. And he said, this is unacceptable. No way can Algebra 1 be the college readiness level for American universities. And it isn't just community colleges we're talking about, it's all colleges. It's college readiness. Private universities, of course, can do what they want in terms of who they admit, although there will be pressures on them because we already know that there are different ways to get what you want from higher ed. And those different ways may come in the form of Pell Grants that come from the federal government. They may come in the way of NSF grants that go to higher ed faculty. There will be strings or pressures applied to get the universities and colleges to ensure that there is a retention rate of those who are admitted, even though they may be below whatever they should be. They cannot be placed in remediation. See, that was the interesting carrot. We have a huge cost right now for remediation in math in higher ed. And one of the things people thought, what a great bargain. We're going to get rid of all that remediation because students are going to be college ready. Well, yes, they will be college ready by definition, and the definition will mean that they take courses for credit, which may be at the very level of grade 11 or lower. So we have gained nothing except a larger number of students who will then get all of these college degrees that President Obama keeps saying we need. But it isn't the college degrees, the paper we need, it's the knowledge that is needed, the skills. Now, let us go on to this validation committee, which was supposed to be the way to validate, because this is a process that researchers understand. You come up with something in education, how do you determine that it really is what you think it is? Well, that was why they wanted this validation committee of about 25 people to make sure that it was comparable to what was in other high-achieving countries, that it was rigorous. And of course, you hear the word used all the time. Is there anyone who hasn't heard Common Core standards not described as rigorous? Every time, I mean, the parrots fly around all the time. The reporters always talk about these very demanding standards. U.S. Chamber of Commerce is always talking about these very demanding standards. It's like a vocabulary word that's been glued to them. So here we were supposed to figure out, how do you determine rigor in a set of standards? Who were these 25 people? Well, Professor Milgram was the only mathematician on the committee. There were so-called math experts, 8 others, but they all had degrees in education. They were all located in schools of education. Now, I was too, and I am not downing schools of education for their function, but they are not content experts. So Professor Milgram was the only mathematician on this committee, and he refused to sign off. I was the only English language standards expert, and I refused to sign off. There were several other people who refused to sign off. But you'd have to wonder about all these other people signing off that these standards are rigorous when they can't examine a set of high school math standards? I can't, to tell you whether they are rigorous or not. How many people who are not engineers, mathematicians, or scientists can look at a set of high school standards to figure out whether they're rigorous? Your high school math teachers could tell you that if they were here, any of them, and those of you who actually work in those professions, but those people weren't on the validation committee. Voila! You have nobody to complain because they're not there. You had no English teachers also on the validation committee until I complained and said, at least one English teacher. How could you not have any? So they finally put on one English teacher, but we never did get a high school math teacher. We never got a literary scholar. So this is why the complaints have started to come as parents have looked at what is coming out from Common Core-based lessons. So I'm now moving up to, say, the last year, because this is when grassroots movement started basically across this country among 4 groups. And you can understand why. The first group were the parents. They're the ones that are finally last year beginning to look at what their kids are doing. And in Catholic schools as well, because they can't figure out why their kids are doing Common Core at all. But many Catholic schools, as you know, have a policy of parents checking kids' homework, so the parents are very careful and are getting more and more upset with what they see. Public school parents, depends on the parent, will look at the children's lessons, but it's probably not as systematic as in some religious schools where it's an obligation to look at the homework that your kids do. So you've got parents rising up state after state, and they were the first audience that I began to talk regularly to. The next group, lo and behold, are the teachers themselves, but they're doing it through their unions because it is very difficult for teachers and administrators to speak up against Common Core. It begins to sound like another country, and I don't mean that, but it really is frightening. Teachers were afraid to speak up, even in their own faculty meetings, because in some cases they were told that it would seem unprofessional to criticize public policy, as if they never had done that in the past. Exactly. And they all knew that their teacher evaluations, which were the focus of Race to the Top, might be used against them. So they were not talking individually, but only within the past few months have the union coordinators and the union reps and the state unions, in a few states, because I've spoken to the people in them, begun to say they're just hearing massive amounts from the teachers, but there's going to be nothing with the teacher's name attached to it. These will be anonymous pages of criticism. And that's what we find from Nashua, New Hampshire. Middle school teachers there were asked to take one of the tests in December, Smarter Balance. That's the one that New Hampshire opted for. And the middle school teachers, this is unusual, but it was a wonderful piece of information that we never could have gotten in any other way. The principal, whose name is John Nelson, of this middle school in Nashua, a month later or so, asked the teachers to write him some comments on the trial tests that the teachers took in December, an early version of SBAC. He was thinking he was going to get some wonderful suggestions for the future about how to help the kids take tests better. He was shocked. These teachers were so critical of the test. They said the math test is basically a test of reading, and the rest of it is so loaded with technology that I couldn't even do it. This is the teacher who was talking. That they have to download or move mouses around or drop boxes or whatever it is. One teacher said this must have been written by such sophisticated test developers that they didn't understand the audience was kids that have to take the test. Not even teachers, but the teachers couldn't do it. And they summed up their remarks by saying the tests were inappropriate because they took both math and ELA at grades 6, 7, and 8, and they begged their state superintendent and their commissioner of ed and others to please let them off the hook for a few years. They simply couldn't possibly train their kids to take these tests, nor did they see any value to these tests. Well, of course, the commissioner of ed in New Hampshire has said, you're taking the test. You're giving the test. I mean, you're giving the test, not to the teachers, but you're giving it to the kids, whether you like it or not. And that's what the superintendent said, because that is what the statute requires. Now, what the parents are trying to figure out is, can they opt their kids out, and what will be the penalty to the kids, because the feds and others are now trying to think about penalties for the kids if they opt out, don't show up. In Massachusetts, I've heard, and perhaps you're familiar with the statute that somebody looked into, that if you're a truant, it will be against your record if you don't show up for the day of the test. Now, in some states, it is legal. A parent can write a permission note and say, my child was upset or ill and simply is not going to be in school this day, or I do not want my child to take any Common Core-based tests whenever my child is in school. But it remains to be seen, and so there may be lawsuits. We don't know. This is a work in progress. We have no idea how this is going to take place. But to finish up this little saga of the validation committee, it finished its work in May of 2010. A form we were given to check off that indeed all of these things that we were validating were indeed validated. 5 of us couldn't, and then of course the final document with a lot of changes, which we didn't know about, came out a week later. So we were asked to validate something that wasn't even the final document. This also goes against any procedure that would have happened in Massachusetts. But what was even more bizarre for me, because I had been so used to civic committees in my home community, Brookline, where I've lived for so many years, very first meeting we had of the validation committee in the fall of 2009, we were given a confidentiality agreement to sign. We could never, ever tell anyone what happened in those meetings. I mean, I'd never had anything like that, but in order to be on the committee, we had to sign it, so we did. But it meant that we could never tell anything about what took place inside the committee and whatever the committee did or came up with. We could, of course, send our own critiques to anybody we wanted, and I did that regularly. I sent them to the Board of Education, because I was on the Board of Education at the time, as well as to the press, or wrote critiques for Pioneer, whatever I could do. Not that anyone cared. I sent it to the standards writers. This was the part that also got me. I would write a 13-page critique, because I write lengthy critiques, go into a lot of detail. I'd send it to the 2 people who were writing the ELA standards. Never a word back. We were supposedly the validation committee. It was like we were in outer space. It didn't matter. They were doing what they wanted to do. There was an agenda. What it was, we didn't know. We knew there was an agenda, but what exactly it was, we couldn't tell. So the burden of all of this is to say that we've got, as far as I'm concerned, an invalid set of standards by an invalid committee created through an invalid process. It didn't follow any of the procedures that we know about, at least in towns and cities in Massachusetts. And yet, this is law. And I don't know how parents can fight it, because they're not good. Even if the standards had been good, people have asked me that question, and I have said, I'm sorry, you still need public discussion and deliberation so people understand what is happening in their children's classrooms and agree, at least by majority vote. That's how we do things. And it didn't take place. I had been part of the process with all of our state standards in Massachusetts. 2 years, 1 to 2 years for each one of them. Board meetings, draft after draft. I mean, there's a large process that takes place. Comments come in, department staff synthesize these comments, they answer them. All the comments are available and accessible to anybody. You can't get a thing on what was said about these standards. I tried. I would ask the people in charge of the project, please give me copies or let me have access to the criticisms that came from certain organizations, professional discipline-based organizations, they wouldn't give me anything. They weren't obligated to. They were private organizations. They finally came out with their own selected summary. Now, I know what that is, of course. There's no usefulness to their own summary of what they happen to read. What are some of the problems with these standards? Jamie's mentioned the few in math. I'm just going to detail them, and I'm taking them mainly from Professor Milgram's own 13-page criticism, which is on his website. So if you want to find detailed critiques of a lot of the math standards, they are on his own website that he maintains, connected with Stanford University. Beginning with the elementary grades, the standard algorithms are taught eventually, but as he points out, too late. Kids have been allowed and encouraged to develop their own algorithms, so by the time they're taught the standard algorithms, they're already acclimated to their own. And it's a lot harder. If you've ever studied a string instrument, you know that if you work out your own positions, it's going to be awfully hard to do what the teacher wants you to do later on for first position or whatever. So that is a problem in the lower grades. He then points out that by grades 6 or 7, our kids are going to be about 2 years behind their peers in high-achieving countries. Middle school is very weak math, and he gives you the details on what he sees as being weak. It doesn't lead to a full year of Algebra 1 in grade 8. Algebra 1 can be begun in grade 8, but it can't be completed until grade 9. So it puts our kids a year, at least, if not more, behind other high-achieving countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Russia, Japan, I've been told, where by grade 6, kids have done almost everything they need to do in arithmetic and study algebra and geometry in grade 7 and 8, so high school is for upper-level coursework. Our kids will barely get to a weak Algebra 2 by the end of high school, maybe by grade 11, and then they have 4th year to do something in math, if they want to, in it. Deferral of Algebra 1 to grade 9, early grade 10 for completion, is a serious issue, but the more serious issue is the one we've discussed, and that is after Algebra 2 Light, there aren't enough trig standards and there are no pre-calculus standards, so kids can actually prepare for a STEM major in college. That's math. English, I'll give you my views of what are the problems in the ELA standards, and then I will stop so you have time for questions. As I pointed out, most of the standards are skills. They're not content standards. They're free-floating skills, which means they can apply to almost anything, and it will be up to the test developers and whoever chooses the curriculum to figure out what level of reading, what kinds of readings you want. Another problem, which became more and more apparent to me, and you may be aware of it if you have young children in the schools, there's a lot more writing than reading at every grade level. Kids are doing an enormous amount of writing, and they're being asked to do things that rhetorically I don't think they're ready for in many cases. Whatever they're being asked to do, it's not coordinated with reading standards at those grade levels. For example, in grade 6 on, kids are asked to establish claims in a piece of writing. Most 6th graders I know about claim checks, but they don't know about a rhetorical claim in a piece of writing. This is harder. Some teachers I've spoken to have tried to figure out how to teach them what a topic sentence is, which is also not in Common Core, because a topic sentence at least gets closer to a thesis sentence or a claim. But it's not going to be easy, and kids are going to be spending an enormous amount of time, not just in ELA, but also in math, where they're being expected to write out why they think certain things are the way they are, which may not make much sense for young kids, very young kids. As a parent of a 2nd grader told me, her child was asked to write out Why is 273 larger than 233? Why? Why? You would get marked down.
What?
That's what the child wrote. It wasn't an adequate answer. You've got to get in something about commutative properties. Whatever it is, there's a whole vocabulary that goes with this.
Second grader?
It's crystal clear to me what that's all about. What that's designed to do is to challenge the student to question why anything is the way it is. And that 273 is a bigger number because someone decided it was. And that's,
There are tens, there are 100s, there are singles, but the teachers don't know how to answer it. Part of the problem here is that most of the teachers can't answer these questions, so the idea is to toss the hot
the
potato
whole idea is
to the
to
kids.
challenge the whole idea that this is the way it is.
Yeah,
That's the whole
well,
idea.
it's certainly challenge, and you will see these words, which parents have been told by teachers and administrators, it's good for them to struggle. Now, yes, to some extent, it is good for kids to struggle. We know that. I mean, but you stretch it too far if you're asking them to do things that aren't developmentally necessary or appropriate at certain ages. There is the claim being made, and everyone agrees, yes, kids should have a conceptual understanding of why they're doing these algorithms. But then the question is, how much time do you spend on it? Like 4 grades worth to do addition and subtraction? This is part of the problem. So that they end up by, as Milgram says in grade 8, they're 2 years behind their peers. So there's something wrong when you stretch out what seems like a reasonable process so long that instead of being competitive, our kids, as Milgram put it last week to me in a very colorful metaphor, they will be the best trained ditch diggers in the 21st century you have ever seen. They have not gone beyond a weak Algebra 2, whereas their peers will have completed much more by high school. Anyway, there's the writing issue and the developmental appropriateness of the standards for the kind of writing they're being asked for. Remember, years ago, we were expected to do the art of the essay starting in around grade 9. And that seemed reasonable because you were exposed to some essays, you understood what the form of an essay was, and someone taught you where the topic sentence was in an essay and what the structure of a good essay might be. So you had a chance to start absorbing the structure of a good piece of informational prose. A good part of the reading battle, and this is why the writing stress is so inappropriate, a good part of the reading battle is kids got to do more reading. We've known that for many years. Reading is the basis for writing. All good writers are good readers. You have to do some writing to become a good writer, but you have to be exposed to a lot of good English prose in order to become a good writer of English prose. So if you're spending an awful lot of time in class on getting kids to do writing, that they're not really prepared to learn quickly and do well with in a shorter amount of time, eventually you get there, but in the meantime you haven't taught a lot of other things. Then there is this switch in the balance, which has never been justified, and then I'm going to stop. You've got less literary reading, more informational reading, and a lot of the damage to the English curriculum is coming from what is called informational reading, because the floodgates have been opened for a lot of stuff that not only is not informational, it's basically poor writing. Some of it is propaganda altogether, as some parents have found. I mean, anything that's not literary is called informational or nonfiction. Then there is this notion that Common Core standards are supposed to be fewer, clearer, and deeper. Well, they're not. This is, again, that parrot up there speaking that's going around saying, oh, they're fewer, clearer, and deeper. They only appear to be fewer, and this is as true in math as it is in English, because a lot of different activities have been bundled into one statement separated by semicolons or colons. I know that trick. I used to try doing it myself when you have a lot of extra things and you want to put it in one sentence. You just separate them by semicolons and say it's one sentence, that's all. I mean, kids know about that too. Here's an example. Literature standard for grades 9 and 10. I want you to understand that there are many examples of this. Think about how many things have to be done to address this so-called standard. Determine a theme or central idea of a text and analyze in detail its development over the course of the text, including how it emerges and is shaped and refined by specific details, and provide an objective summary of the text. That's all one standard. Now, what teachers have had to be doing all over the country is unpacking these sentences to find out how many different things are required in them. So that's where I'm going to end up right now, because I think we need to have your questions about what is happening in the schools at this point. Thank you.